Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, When Old Laws Threaten New Climate Ambitions, a New York Case Study. I'm Derek Sylvan. I'm the Strategy Director at the Institute for Policy Integrity at NYU School of Law. I'll be moderating today's event. We have a very impressive group of panelists who I'll introduce shortly. They'll be sharing their insights on a topic that we think is critically important, but largely under-discussed in climate and energy policy. And that is conflicts between the state legislation that mandates ambitious greenhouse gas reductions and legacy laws that enable, or in many cases actively encourage, the consumption of fossil fuels. The extent to which states are able to resolve these conflicts is likely to play an outsized role in determining the success of many climate laws around the country. Today's event is hosted by the Institute for Policy Integrity as well as Environmental Defense Fund. I'm sure many of you know about Environmental Defense Fund's work in this area. EDF is prolific and works across a wide range of issues. Their work on energy policy in particular is exceptional, and Elizabeth Stein of EDF, who we'll hear from today, plays a large role in that fantastic output. For those of you who may not be as familiar with the Institute for Policy Integrity, we are a nonpartisan think tank and advocacy organization based at NYU School of Law. Our staff consists mostly of lawyers and economists, and we primarily focus on energy and environmental policy, both at the state and federal levels. We produce research and engage in policy proceedings as well as litigation. And for those of you who are interested in today's topic, I especially encourage you to check out more of our energy policy work. In recent months, some of my colleagues at Policy Integrity have released academic articles and reports on energy policy topics, including how the federal government can use existing authority to rapidly expand high voltage electric transmission around the country, legal and economic dimensions of carbon pricing in wholesale energy markets, opportunities for Federal Energy Regulatory Commission improvements that can better address climate change issues, some work on possibilities for reform in capacity markets and methods to quantify the pollution reductions and overall environmental value provided by distributed energy resources. So there is a lot of great work there, including and as well as a lot of work in some other focus areas that I encourage you all to take a look at. Today's event is an outgrowth of a fantastic paper that was recently published in the Energy Law Journal by Justin Gundlach, my colleague at Policy Integrity, and Elizabeth Stein of EDF. Their paper analyzes conflicts between New York's landmark Climate Change and Community Protection Act and some existing laws related to natural gas infrastructure. And their paper offers some insights on how to overcome these conflicts. If you haven't already read it, I highly recommend that you take a look. In a moment, we'll hear from Justin and Elizabeth, who will share a few of the key takeaways from the paper, but there's a lot more great content there than they will have time to discuss today. After we hear from Justin and Elizabeth, we'll have a chance to hear from our three other panelists who will share their own insights on this topic. We'll first hear from Michael Girard, a professor at Columbia Law School, where he's the founder and faculty director of the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law. Among many other accomplishments, he's the co-editor of the highly influential Legal Pathways to Deep Decarbonization in the United States. And he is responsible directly or indirectly for a great deal of thinking and work on questions of how to turn climate goals and policy ideas into laws and regulations. We'll then turn to Rory Christian, who's principal at Concentric Consulting Group. Rory's worked on energy issues in both the public, private, and nonprofit sector, including overseeing energy and sustainability for the New York City Housing Authority. Rory's also a board member of We Act for Environmental Justice. And finally, we will hear from Dale Brick, Senior Fellow for Energy and the Environment with the Regional Plan Association. And among other highlights, Dale was Governor Cuomo's Deputy Secretary for Energy and Environment when the CLCPA was enacted. So we're going to try to save roughly half an hour for Q&A and discussion at the end of our time today. So I encourage everyone to submit questions at any point through the Q&A window on the Zoom screen. You can also view questions that have already been submitted in the window and use the upvote function to select any that you find especially compelling. So we'll keep an eye on the questions and the upvotes and try to get to as many questions as we can. Before I hand things off to Justin and Elizabeth, I just want to offer a few short framing remarks on today's topic. So while much of the focus of today's discussion will be on New York, these issues are highly relevant in many other states. To date, 15 different states have adopted statutory emissions reductions targets, and several others have adopted executive targets for reductions. And this is a rapidly evolving space. Many of these targets have been adopted just in the past year or two. It's very likely that more will be adopted in the near future. The existing state targets that are around are set at different levels. Many are extremely ambitious, with New York's Climate Change and Community Protection Act possibly setting the standard with a mandate for at least 85% gross emissions reductions by 2050 compared to 1990 levels. And that is aiming for an economy-wide net zero emissions target in the state by 2050. For New York and most of these other states, it will not be possible to meet these targets without electrifying space and water heating, as well as cooking. And the key tools that govern building electrification are gas utility regulation and building codes. And these are and will continue to be subject of state law and in some cases municipal law rather than federal law. And the collision between decarbonization efforts and the use of gas in buildings is already happening and will only become more dramatic over time. And there are a number of localities that have adopted bans on new gas hookups or have used building codes to exclude gas from new construction. However, at least 3 state legislatures have banned localities from adopting such bans. Just yesterday, Mayor de Blasio announced an intention to push New York City to ban fossil fuel connections in new construction by 2030. Earlier, New Yorkers had faced moratoriums on new gas hookups after proposals to increase gas pipeline capacity were rejected. And so as these sort of policy options and conflicts simmer, it's become evident that no state has a very clear plan about how to accomplish the transition away from fossil fuel use in buildings. But multiple states, including New York, have recently begun grappling with this problem and some of the issues surrounding it, including how to reconcile new climate laws with existing gas distribution infrastructure, rules about gas consumption in buildings, and residents' reliance on gas, especially in cold weather states. So Elizabeth and Justin's paper is an ideal starting point in this discussion, so I will hand things off to them now. Elizabeth Stein is the lead counsel for energy transition strategy at Environmental Defense Fund. She focuses largely on reducing reliance on oil and gas in the transportation and building sectors. Much of Elizabeth's work centers on policies in New York and New Jersey, and she's written extensively on utility reform and electrification. And Justin Gunlock is a senior attorney at the Institute for Policy Integrity, where he focuses largely on state-level energy and climate policy. He is the co-editor of the book Climate Change, Public Health and the Law, and the author of a number of articles, book chapters, amicus briefs, and other publications on the impacts of energy use on climate and infrastructure and public health. Justin was previously a member of the policy development team at the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority and a staff attorney at the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law. So with that, I will hand things off to Elizabeth and Justin to talk a bit more about the paper that's at the heart of today's event.
Thank you for that introduction, Derek. All right, I'm going to put another version of a similar screen up. All right. So to start, thank you, Policy Integrity and EDF for co-hosting this event, and to all of you for attending. We think that this is an urgently important topic, but I am very aware of just how many webinars are out there competing for your time and attention, so thank you for coming. Here is the outline of what Elizabeth and I will cover today. It is less detailed than our lengthy article. We're going to pass the mic back and forth as we go. Elizabeth will start with a description of the tensions in New York State between climate commitments and the laws that govern gas consumption and gas distribution infrastructure. I will then explain why New York's Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, CLCPA is I think the acronym you're going to hear a lot of today, which is ambitious and laudable and important, does not seem to offer complete resolution to those tensions that Elizabeth describes. After that, Elizabeth will describe some concrete measures that we recommend, and I'll conclude with principles that we think should serve as guidelines or guardrails for policymakers. So with that, Elizabeth.
Thanks, Justin. In the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which became law in July 2019, New York lawmakers took note of the profound threats climate change poses to the state of New York. In response, they adopted some of the deepest economy-wide greenhouse gas reduction mandates ever, 40% below a 1990 baseline by 2030 and 85% by 2050, preferably eliminating anthropogenic emissions by 2050. The CLCPA is not explicit about the decarbonization pathway for any sector other than the electric sector, but the scale of these economy-wide mandates implies that major action is going to be needed with respect to natural gas. The figure on the screen, which is based on 2016 data, is included in our paper. It is from the most recent snapshot we have of New York's greenhouse gas emissions, a 2019 report from the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. According to that report, the 2016 economy-wide total was 205.61 million metric tons, with fossil fuel combustion accounting for the lion's share, 166 million. As we can see here, that report showed that combustion of natural gas produced more greenhouse gas emissions than combustion of any other single fuel. Moreover, by doing a little math, we can see that the 2016 level of combustion-related emissions from natural gas simply cannot be permitted to continue indefinitely. The 2019 report includes a 1990 economy-wide emissions total of 236.19 million metric tons. 15% of that number, an 85% reduction, is roughly the highest level of economy-wide emissions that the CLCPA will allow. As a side note, the Department of Environmental Conservation has set a new official 1990 baseline for statewide emissions, as well as 2030 and 2050 goals. The new baselines and goals incorporate important science-based strictures mandated in the CLCPA. However, there is not yet an updated greenhouse gas inventory based on the same methodology. Therefore, for purposes of this discussion, we continue to refer to the 2019 greenhouse gas inventory. A 1990 baseline of 236.19 million metric tons implies a 2030 statewide emissions budget of 147 million metric tons and a 2050 budget of 35 million metric tons. In other words, based on the pre-CLCPA methodology, combustion of natural gas as of 2016 was producing more than double the state's entire 2050 greenhouse gas budget if that budget was to be 85% below 1990 emissions. One way or another, emissions associated with natural gas must drop precipitously. In theory, that could happen by stopping the combustion, changing the fuel to one with different life cycle characteristics, or through carbon capture, but there is no doubt they must be dramatically cut. And that's based on the 2016 data compiled using pre-CLCPA methodologies. In fact, the CLCPA implies an outlook for natural gas that may be even more bleak. The CLCPA requires that the best available scientific, technological, and economic information on greenhouse gas emissions be used to develop the 1990 baseline for statewide greenhouse gas emissions. It also defines statewide greenhouse gas emissions to include upstream greenhouse gases associated with extraction and transmission of fossil fuels into New York State. Plus, the definition of carbon dioxide equivalent requires that other greenhouse gases should be compared to carbon based on their global warming impacts over a 20-year horizon. This should raise red flags for the natural gas sector. We know that a high level of methane emissions is associated with natural gas extraction and transmission, most of which does not occur in New York State, and therefore prior to the CLCPA was not accounted for in our greenhouse gas inventories. And we know that methane, the primary component of natural gas, is a short-term climate forcer. Thus, while the specifics may be up for grabs, the required trajectory of natural gas use may need to be even steeper than what we can infer from the 2019 greenhouse gas inventory. And as heating residential and commercial buildings doesn't appear to lend itself to carbon capture, significant reductions in the extent of the distribution system seem essentially certain. As I mentioned previously, the DEC has now adopted a new regulation setting the 1990 baseline and 2030 and 2050 targets in accordance with the rigorous methodologies set forth in the law. But without a current greenhouse gas inventory that uses these same methodologies, we cannot yet ascertain exactly where we are now in terms of overall emissions. That is, where we are relative to the 1990 baseline, where we are relative to 2030 and 2050 goals, and the precise share of today's emissions attributable to natural gas. As for the natural gas system, we have some sense of where we are. We are somewhere to the left of the inflection point shown on this slide. Don't know exactly where, but somewhere to the left, where the natural gas system stops expanding and starts contracting. Our paper focuses on certain long-standing features of utility law and regulations that are making it harder for New York to reach that inflection point. These examples are not comprehensive, merely illustrative of a broader issue. For example, Section 30 of New York's Public Service Law states that it is, and I'm paraphrasing here, the policy of this state that the continued provision of gas, electric, and steam service to residential customers without unreasonable qualifications or lengthy delays is in the public interest. Section 31, which covers new gas and electric service to residential customers, provides that the Commission may require applicants for service to buildings located in excess of 100 feet from gas or electric transmission lines to pay or agree to pay in writing, material and installation costs related to the applicant's proportion of the pipe, conduit, duct, or wire, or other facilities to be installed. This provision is the source of what has come to be known as the 100-foot rule, whereby natural gas extensions to new customers are free to the applicant, that is, paid for by other ratepayers up to the first 100 feet. The entire provision contemplates a single prospective customer making a discrete request and being charged based on their distance from the existing system, and so seems primarily applicable to buildings that are relatively close to the existing system. However, the 100-foot rule now in effect for gas service in New York is far more sweeping than Section 31 alone provides. 16 NYCRR Part 230, adopted by the Public Service Commission in 1986, expanded the entitlement in at least two respects. First, it specified that the utility must pay for both 100 feet of main and 100 feet of service line for any applicant. Second, the regulation gave every prospective customer their own separate 100 feet of main and 100 feet of service line, regardless of how far they are from the existing system. And in practice, these per customer entitlements have sometimes been pooled to construct significant line extensions to groups of customers, all very far from the existing main, at no cost or reduced cost to them. Shrinking the system or the use of the system can lead to assets becoming stranded. The bigger the system gets before it starts contracting, the more assets are likely to become stranded. The CLCPA makes it obvious that we must reach and move beyond that inflection point, while not expressly addressing these statutory and regulatory provisions that keep us firmly to the left of it, which means this tension is already increasing the stranded costs that future New Yorkers are likely to be saddled with. And now here's Justin to talk about some CLCPA provisions that offer some resolution.
Thanks, Elizabeth. So the CLCPA sets big, ambitious targets, as Elizabeth described, for reducing economy-wide emissions and for deploying clean electricity generation resources. But it does not direct state agencies or private actors to disregard existing laws, even those that enable or encourage fossil fuel consumption. Instead, it contains two provisions, Section 7 and 8, that vaguely direct agencies to adjust how they comply with other statutory obligations. And in addition to those provisions, the CLCPA obviously directs the state to try to eliminate all greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Arguably, this supports claims of what is called implied repeal, meaning that a subsequent law, in this case the CLCPA, does not say that it repeals an earlier one, but is so at odds with an earlier adopted law that a court confronted with both must read the later law as effectuating the repeal of some or all of the earlier one. We looked at each of these closely. All three are important, but they do not, individually or in combination, fully undo the legal provisions that potentially undermine the CLCPA's goals. Section 7 caused a lot of excitement when people first saw it. It says that when an agency acts, and I am paraphrasing mostly, it must consider whether that action, here I'm quoting, is, quote, inconsistent with or will interfere with the attainment of statewide emissions reduction targets. If the action isn't consistent with those targets, then the agency must, quote, provide a detailed statement of justification, end quote, and also identify alternatives or measures to make up for the emissions impacts of the project at issue. So superficially, it sounds like agencies must conform their actions to the CLCPA's targets or offer a justification that could then, in principle, be scrutinized in court. It is true that Section 7 is likely to cause agencies to offer different reasoning for a decision with implications for emissions, and also that Section 7 will create a basis for advocates and possibly courts to push agencies to change their decisions. But several key terms in Section 7, like consider, inconsistent, attainment, are ambiguous, and it is not clear who is empowered to deem an action to be inconsistent. It could be the agency itself. Section 7 is meant to put guardrails up to limit agency action. Section 8 is meant to create generic authority for agencies other than the Department of Environmental Conservation to use as needed to implement the CLCPA. But it is mainly an authorization and not a directive. And it imposes no deadlines or parameters for action. As such, it doesn't create a clear and direct basis for going against whatever statutes, other than the CLCPA, govern the activity in question. I won't go into detail about the legal standard for implied repeal. That discussion, if you want to read it, is on pages 242 to 45 of our article. But I will say this, even winning in court on implied repeal is unlikely to yield a coherent or thorough repudiation of laws that stand in the way of decarbonization. That's not to diminish some future legal victory based on this argument, but it must be recognized as, at best, a limited tool. It could clear a minor blockage or spur action, but it can only sweep away so much, and it can't be the source of a new approach. Now, I don't want to give the impression with this quick review that we are being dismissive of the changes that will flow from the CLCPA. It sets bold targets, creates meaningful new regulatory authority, and ensures that progress, whatever its pace, will be measured rigorously. But the Act relies on multiple entities, including the Climate Action Council and advisory panels and working groups, as well as state agencies, to formulate plans for concrete action and to do so through a multi-year process. And while the CLCPA establishes tools to support agency action in line with those plans, the Act is rightly understood as a framework, an unfinished structure that will gain clarity and solidity over years, not months. So while the CLCPA's targets imply an existential threat to gas utilities, its provisions don't prescribe exactly how they or their regulators should proceed. Section 7 directs the Public Service Commission to align its decisions with the CLCPA, but it leaves wiggle room, and that room can potentially be exploited. With that, I'm going to turn the mic back to Elizabeth.
Thank you, Justin. Broadly, Justin and I in our paper identify 3 pathways for addressing the tensions between long-standing laws and rules that encourage fossil fuel reliance on the one hand and greenhouse gas mandates on the other. Legislation. The legislature could harmonize energy law with climate law expressly by amending or eliminating statutory provisions that undermine achievement of the goals of the CLCPA, such as Public Service Law Sections 30 and 31. For example, Section 30 currently says that it is in the public interest to continue whatever form of energy service is currently provided to a customer, gas, electric, or steam. The legislature almost certainly didn't mean for this provision to lock society into a particular fuel or technology forever. Its aim was presumably to protect customers. But whatever the aim, today Section 30 expressly characterizes continuing gas service as being in the public interest, which may no longer be true, while Section 31 mandates that certain gas line extensions are to be provided to customers at no cost to them. Amendments could clarify that what is in the public interest is that residents have access to energy and to heat, and could end the practice of new fossil fuel infrastructure expansions as an individual entitlement. Regulations. We make several suggestions for rule changes in our paper. You can read them on pages 254 through 251 through 54. But one area that may be worth exploring is for the Commission to modify Part 230, the regulation that currently expands the Section 31 entitlement from a narrow provision to a sweeping one. The Commission could diminish the conflict between the legislature's greenhouse gas goals and the 100-foot rule by amending Part 230 such that the 100-foot rule would no longer reach further than 100 feet from the existing system, bringing it closer to what is contemplated in the plain language of Section 31. One can also imagine amendments to Part 230 that would make the high cost of the 100-foot rule visible to customers and policymakers by requiring benefit cost analysis and examination of alternatives. In addition, Part 230's limitation of these free expansions to what it calls reasonably permanent customers also deserves a hard look. With 2030 and 2050 targets looming, how many prospective new customers can have a reasonable expectation that they will rely on natural gas permanently? And oversight. When utilities seek recovery of costs through rate cases, regulators can compel them to answer probing questions. Section 7 of the CLCPA provides the Commission with a clear statutory basis for compelling gas utilities to explain whether and how their plans align with and will not interfere with achieving the CLCPA's emission reduction targets. These are just a few examples. A recent EDF white paper, Aligning Gas Regulation and Climate Goals, provides a more comprehensive national perspective on the kinds of actions that are available to utility regulators seeking to harmonize their natural gas utility oversight and regulation with climate policy. And with that, back to Justin.
Thanks, Elizabeth. So as I mentioned at the top, in addition to proposing specific measures, we also identified 3 principles that we think should guide reforms, both of the gas system and also of other key areas of energy transition. First, not foremost, just first, is technology and fuel neutrality, meaning avoiding rules and practices that create an enduring bias in favor of particular resources. It might seem odd to make this a guiding principle. Decarbonizing means electrifying in many cases, and electrifying means promoting the uptake of particular technologies like electric heat pumps. But for at least 2 reasons, we still think it's a good idea. The first reason is about the future. As we found with Public Service Law Section 30, not making technology neutrality a priority can result in the lock-in of approaches that, even for unforeseeable reasons, become outmoded or problematic. The second reason is about the present. Prioritizing technology neutrality means taking a critical look at how existing rules and system features work and clearing away barriers to entry that are not justified. Safe and just transition are next. These are distinct, but they overlap. Each one is about striking a balance. Safety in the near term means access to heating and water heating, as well as the safe operation of the gas distribution system. But it also means safety in relation to indoor air quality and, over the longer term, to the impacts of climate change. So safe transition means moving swiftly but not suddenly or in a disorganized way from fossil gas to alternatives. Just transition is about costs and who pays them. When those who can afford to replace gas-fired equipment and appliances defect from the gas system, they cease helping to pay the sizable fixed costs that come with gas distribution infrastructure. Their departure can also create new costs by changing features that inform utilities' engineering, as well as operational decisions. Further, utilities whose assets are contracting, not expanding, with no future equilibrium in sight, are going to have a harder time securing financing. So just transition means not penalizing gas customers who can't afford to electrify, while also covering the costs of system maintenance as gas utilities' business model transforms. We're going to end there and turn things over to Derek and our discussants.
Great, thank you, Justin and Elizabeth. Some really interesting material there that I'm sure we will get into in more depth in the Q&A. Quick reminder, you can submit questions through the Zoom Q&A window at any time. Please do use the Q&A window instead of the chat window if possible for that. And you can also upvote any questions that you find compelling. We'll get to as many of them as we can during the Q&A session. We will now hear from Michael Gerard, professor at Columbia Law School, where he is the founder and faculty director of the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks very much, Derek. Thank you for organizing this. I want to start by congratulating Justin and Elizabeth on a terrific piece of work. You have highlighted a fairly obscure area of law, done it in a very clear way, and I'm very happy that you have brought these issues to the forefront. What I'm going to concentrate on are what are some of the implications of what Justin and Elizabeth have talked about in terms of moving away from natural gas, what that means for electricity supply and for generation, transmission, and storage. We can move away from natural gas, but people will still want to heat their homes and businesses and cook their food and take hot showers. So they'll still be using energy in some fashion. So I'm going to share my screen here. Okay. So in terms of where New York State's electricity came from in 2019, as indicated, natural gas was the largest part of it. A chunk was from nuclear, but that's declining with significantly with the closure of the Indian Point nuclear power plant. A good deal came from hydro, and if we import more from Canada, more may come from hydro. And only a very small portion so far of the electricity came from wind and solar, but it's onto wind and solar that we want to load the great bulk of the of new electricity demand. So this is the supply. In terms of the demand, this is from DEC and NYSERDA. So 34% of greenhouse gas emissions in New York have come from transportation, but we want to move most of that over to electricity as we electrify the vehicle fleet. 32% came from buildings, most of that the combustion of natural gas and oil. And for heating and water heating and so forth, we want to move as much of that over to electricity as we can as well. So what does all this mean for the demand for electricity? A study was done for NYSO a couple of years ago that looked at what would be the demand for electricity with residential electrification. And so we see this is what happens with as a result of electrifying cooking, water heating, secondary heating, and then the heat pumps on which we would rely for much of the new heat. Very considerable increase in electricity demand on the residential side. We also are going to see a tremendous increase in electricity demand on the transportation side. This is from a different NYSO report, and it shows what happens to electricity usage as we electrify vehicle fleets. When we add up electrification of residential and businesses and transport and whatever else we want to electrify, this is from the NYSO report I mentioned earlier. And you can see this is what otherwise would have been expected to be the demand for electricity in New York State. And this is what it could become. This is about a 40% increase in the demand for electricity, even after significant energy efficiency measures. Now, there are a number of assumptions built into this. It could be somewhat higher than 40 or somewhat lower than 40, but it gives you the general idea. In terms of where this added electricity will come from, there are two studies that I'm aware of that have tried to answer that question. One of them was done for NYSERDA by Energy and Environmental Economics, and it sketched out separating out between upstate and downstate what the new sources of electricity would be. Then the other study was done for NYSO by the analysis group, which undertook a similar kind of analysis with somewhat different assumptions and analysis years and so forth. But just comparing them, this is what the current generation capacity is from each of these sources. This is what the E3 study for NYSERDA showed and the analysis group study for NYSO. The numbers are pretty much pretty much consistent with each other, except that the analysis group study has a lot more land-based wind. But both of them show just tremendous increases in all of these sources of land-based wind and offshore wind and solar. Each of those would go up just enormously. To give a sense of the scale, this NYSO report estimated that in order to achieve the numbers that they were showing, each and every year from 2020 through 2040, we would need to add more than 2,700 megawatts of wind capacity, both land-based and offshore, and 1,962 megawatts each and every year of grid-connected solar. To put that in perspective, The largest proposed offshore wind farm in New York State, which was just announced by Governor Cuomo a couple of weeks ago, would be 1,260 megawatts. So we would basically need more than two of them, the equivalent of that, each and every year, 2020 to 2040. The largest proposed solar farm in New York State, the South Ripley Farm in Chautauqua County, 270 megawatts. We would need the equivalent of about 7 of those each and every year from 2020 to 2040. There are some particular additional complications that all of this raises. First place, we're going to have a tremendous need for balancing resources, since, as we all know, wind and solar are intermittent. And so presumably some combination of batteries and demand response, maybe renewable gas, maybe technologies that we don't have yet, certainly more transmission to bring in the energy, but a lot of balancing resources are going to be necessary. Rising temperatures due to climate change are going to increase the air conditioning load. But notwithstanding that, the peak electricity demand, which is now in the summer, is going to shift to the winter as building heating becomes electric. When we have cold days like today, we are today burning a whole lot of oil and natural gas around the state. And if this were all electric, it would generate a peak electricity demand on days like today. We also know that there is often very significant local opposition to proposals for new facilities of any kind, and that's certainly the case with wind and solar and transmission. The Sabin Center for Climate Change Law that I run has started something called the Renewable Energy Legal Defense Initiative that provides pro bono legal assistance to community groups and others that want wind and solar and transmission that are facing local opposition. But this kind of local opposition has become and will continue to be a major impediment to building out at the scale that is necessary in order to meet these demands. And the final thing I'll mention here is, to the extent we need to retrofit buildings to both electrify and improve energy efficiency, that's very expensive, and huge questions about who's going to pay for that, particularly in low income and minority communities. So my final slide is showing some of the legal processes that are involved in all of this, and we need to get all of them right in order for this to happen. So the Climate Action Council is hard at work now coming up with its scoping plan pursuant to the CLCPA. That plan is due 1 year from now, and it's going to have to lay out in considerable detail what all of this would look like. NYSERDA has been issuing solicitations for renewables. It'll do more of that. They'll also do some solicitations for transmission. We face some important decisions about carbon pricing. Will we have carbon pricing in the wholesale electricity markets as NYSO has proposed? That would require the approval from FERC, although these days that seems to be likely. How does this interact with the Clean Energy Standard and the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative? Do we have all of them, one or two of them? What would be the price? All of those are important questions to be determined. In order to address the very large amount of new renewable capacity that's needed, last year the legislature enacted the Accelerated Renewable Growth and Community Benefit Act to replace the old Article 10 siting process to try to speed up the approval of renewable generation and also speed up the siting of transmission lines. So that's just getting started. It has to work in a big way in order to achieve our objectives. The approvals of the U.S. Bureau of Ocean Energy Management are needed in order to have leasing and permitting for offshore wind. That was held up in the Trump administration. We're optimistic that under the Biden administration, that's going to go more quickly, but that's another prerequisite. And layered on top of all of this are the emerging environmental justice processes that we're seeing at the New York State level and that I think we'll soon be seeing at the federal level, which are extremely important and will become fundamental procedural accompaniments or overlays on all these other siting processes. So we have a huge job to do in replacing the natural gas that is to be replaced in order to comply with the CLCPA and to carry out the sorts of objectives that Elizabeth and Justin have talked about. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Michael. We will now hear from Rory Christian, a principal at Concentric Consulting Group. Rory's worked in many different roles in energy policy in both the public and private sector and has a strong grasp of the competing stakeholder priorities. I'm excited to hear his insights on these issues.
Thank you, Derek. And I want to thank again EDF for doing the research to bring these issues to focus, and also for taking the time to clarify the evolving GHG accounting process. I know that's going to be incredibly critical as these discussions continue. And again, thank you NYU for putting this event together and all the panelists and participants today. I have no slides, but I do want to talk through a number of potential concerns that the paper identified and what can happen in the real world if these concerns aren't addressed. Again, the paper does an amazing job documenting the myriad of issues we face and highlighting the importance of what's at stake. And to put it bluntly, it's incredibly timely given where things are with the CAC, the Climate Action Council. We all know the goal. We want to decarbonize the economy, and we want to do it quickly enough to minimize the increasingly severe and frequent impacts of climate change. Now, state leadership in New York has already taken some fairly significant steps forward against climate change, and this includes both adaptation efforts aimed at preparing us for those increasingly frequent and severe events, but also mitigation, which aim to lower emissions, the main driver of those events. And through this paper, they've described a unique problem that actually straddles the divide between mitigation and adaptation. The laws and regulations they've identified have served to build out a system which has helped our state and national economy grow to where they are today. But for us to reach the future where we can maintain the lifestyles we've grown accustomed to while minimizing our impact on the environment, all these policies must be reconsidered. Policies like these, the continuity of which mainly serve to maintain the status quo, a status quo largely defined by a one-way system where the distinction between producers and consumers of energy is sharply defined and increasingly at odds with long-term goals at the state and hopefully soon federal level as well. With the electric system, we see it very clearly. Rooftop solar is rapidly becoming the norm, and battery storage and EV adoption grows by leaps and bounds each year, a growth that's expected to continue and accelerate in many parts of the country. As these related technology become the norm, that dividing line between customers, producers, users is rapidly becoming blurred. Now, the beauty of this, the state has already thought through this issue and brought this problem to focus through the Reforming the Energy Vision Initiative, better known as REV. This was the beginning of a process to transition the electric system away from its origins as a centralized system to a decentralized, distributed one. A system where distributed resources can be integrated into the grid to benefit everyone using methods at a lower cost when compared to traditional options. This transition away from a one-way, the centralized system we're all familiar with, to a two-way decentralized system where individual customers can collectively play a role in maintaining the health and stability of the grid will become increasingly necessary as the grid adopts more intermittent renewables, and this benefit can help consumers, utilities alike, and help accelerate the state's path towards its emissions reductions goals. This dynamism inherent in the electric system is the backbone of the state's emissions reductions investments making the grid more flexible, and should highlight how significant the potential for the grid to handle the burden we're going to place on it can be. However, the same can't be said for the natural gas system. Now, as previously stated by everyone on this panel today, getting to 85 by 50 simply will not be possible if we maintain our current level of combustion of natural gas. But despite awareness of this and recognition through a plethora of policies, executive orders, and other actions around climate change, if my gas boiler were to break today, or yours, it'd be far easier to replace it with another gas boiler and keep on moving. And worse, the state would probably provide a rebate check for doing just that. And there's likely a federal tax credit you can tack onto that as well. So we need to look at these incentives that reinforce and continue to amplify the use of natural gas and think through how they can be tailored to motivate people towards using electric or other low emission alternatives. How the state is going to manage its increasingly limited funds to coordinate this transition is already a hotly debated topic in the Climate Action Council. And as we move forward towards electrification, we'll be examining how ratepayer funds are used to buttress the natural gas system, enable the installation of equipment that will prolong the need for that system, and also infrastructure needed to maintain the system, gas pipes, gas mains. All of this will be under increasing scrutiny. And this is largely in part to what Elizabeth pointed out earlier, the potential for stranded assets. This is a significant concern. And again, as you make the system bigger and you have more assets, the potential for them to become stranded only serves to grow. The boiler in my home may last 20 or 30 years, but investments in gas infrastructure are rated to have lives of 50, 60, in some cases 80 years. 2050 isn't even 30 years away. Putting infrastructure into the ground that's expected to have such a long, useful life, that's an open question. And that may prove to be a misallocation of resources of epic proportions. So we need to reconsider what we are investing in the gas system, how we're going to continue using the gas system, and ensure that incentives are aligned to minimize the growth of that system and accelerate the transition of people towards electric uses. Now, this misalignment is super important for customers that lack the financial means to make the transition towards electricity. You have many low-income homeowners, affordable housing developers, and rental tenants, which lack the financial means, the resources, or the ability to make this conversion. So we need to align those incentives in a just and equitable manner to ensure that those with the greatest need can take advantage of this opportunity and be a part of the transition as with the rest of society. Now, while we're focusing on advancing the market for acceleration, we also need to look at protections to ensure that the transition from gas to electricity doesn't create an economic burden for low-income homeowners and others. Now, this is essentially the beginning of a much larger concern, the view of stranded customers. There are going to be some customers who are going to electrify before others, absolutely. And as they affect from the gas system, the cost to maintain that system will be spread around a smaller customer pool. Now, as this transition moves on, we have an increasing number of people transitioning away from the system. The costs for those that remain will only steadily increase, potentially trapping them and limiting their opportunities for migration to electric. So we need to think of that, and we need to find ways to address that potential issue. Further, the cost to provide heat and hot water is largely socialized in multifamily buildings. Many tenants may pay their utilities directly for electric use, but for the vast majority, the rent covers their share of heating and hot water. If we move forward with electrification through mandates, landlords may be using electrification as an opportunity to shift those costs to tenants. We need to be sure that we can establish protections to ensure that they don't create additional burdens to renter by transferring those costs from the landlord without an equivalent adjustment to rent. That's a major consideration that we need to consider in any pathway forward. And then finally, we need to also make sure all of this is equitable. And that will mean looking at rates, understanding that the current rate regime is based to develop and maintain the system as it is. We need to reconsider how rates are deployed and how they're developed to ensure that the customers who have to transition and will transition do not experience unexpected spikes in costs as a result. Now, how the state addresses these issues today, there will be significant future ramifications. The good news, as has been mentioned, the CLCPA, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, provides a pathway for individuals to share their concerns and for different advocacy groups to work together towards ensuring that these protections and other provisions are put in place. Ultimately, all the existing laws and regulations must be evaluated to minimize the potential for creating a wider economic divide between the haves and the have-nots as the pace of electrification quickens. And addressing them today to ensure funds are allocated towards these populations in an equitable manner is going to be essential to long-term success. So, thank you all.
Great, thank you very much, Rory. We will finally hear from Dale Brick, a Senior Fellow for Energy and the Environment at the Regional Plan Association. Her work with RPA focuses largely on scaling building energy efficiency and electrification and transitioning utilities away from fossil fuels to carbon-free energy sources. As I mentioned earlier, Dale was also Governor Cuomo's Deputy Secretary for Energy and Environment when the CLCPA was enacted, and she spent a great deal of time thinking through the issues at the heart of today's discussion, so we're very pleased to be able to hear from her today.
Thank you so much. And I want to add my thanks to Elizabeth and Justin for this fantastic paper. I send it to everybody, many people who are not lawyers, so I'm so glad you're doing this to flesh it out for the non-legal minds to wrap their minds around all of this stuff. And this is a very rich discussion. So glad you're recording it for people. So I want to drill a little bit more into the suite of solutions to this whole challenge, in addition to tackling directly the 100-foot rule, and also think about, like, why haven't we solved all of these problems already, and what more we can do to help get those solutions going. So one thing I think that's clear to all of us who are talking about this, but not out there in the general population, is the public realization and government signals at every level of government that this is where we're going. If we want to solve climate, and if we don't want pipelines, or we don't want fracking, or whatever, and we still want to have heat and everything, that we are going to be electrifying buildings. And we have to adopt the policies and programs needed to massively scale energy efficiency and electrification. And then on the flip side, on the utility side, we are going to be transitioning from the utility businesses that we have now, electric, some are combined electric and gas, but we have a lot of standalone natural gas utilities. Like, that is completely changing if we're going to have a place where almost nobody is using any fossil fuels in buildings for heat and cooking. And we have, a 20-year runway, but let's not wait 19 years to start planning, how we're going to transition, because the stranded costs and a lot of other problems are going to be waiting for us if we don't do that. And if we had that clear signal from government policy at every level, that would help make sure that, for one, you're giving the HVAC industry a clear signal that they have to shift gears. That has not happened yet. Heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. Sorry, I shouldn't use lingo. As well as to make sure that the utilities really put in the kind of plans that we need to see from them for the long term, and that we're not going to solve this problem with renewable natural gas. We're not going to solve it with hydrogen. Not that those things don't have a role, but that's not what's going to be the big solution for the overwhelming majority of buildings for heating and cooking. So just having that, I think, would be huge. On the utility side, we have a gas planning proceeding here in New York. I think there's only 4 other states that are doing gas planning proceedings. And shockingly, we haven't required utilities on the gas side, as we have on the electric side, to provide long-term plans of how they're going to keep the heat on, not just in the coming winter, but in multiple years and decades, so that people can kick the tires on those plans and say things like, this doesn't align with other policy goals that we have, and have that lead time instead of, in very, very short-term planning and not the transparency that's needed of what we have now. And of course, the whole utility business model is geared up to sell therms of gas. People are required to deliver gas, not heating. They're driven to expand the customer base and build large infrastructure. That's how they make their money, but they make their money based on the rules that the government sets for them. So if we want utilities to be in a different business, if we want them to be in the business of providing heat at least cost over the long term, and we want them to be in the business of designing a just and equitable transition, as everyone has been describing, then we need to set the rules for them that will drive them to do that. And right now, as Elizabeth and Justin lay out so well in the paper, we're giving them conflicting signals. So let's stop doing that. And I think, we've mentioned a lot of the sort of the examples of what's wrong there, that we're allowing the way those rules work. They can propose plans where they're amortizing the cost of new gas distribution system investments over 80 years when we know we have to stop using that in 20 years. So, that doesn't make any sense. We have to think about how do we make sure we're not leaving the customers who are least able to afford it to shoulder the entire cost of the distribution system once the wealthier customers electrify and take themselves off of that system. And the issue of, Elizabeth had that great little picture with the houses, socializing the cost of expanding the infrastructure to any customer who asked for it. There's going to be new construction or people who are switching from home heating oil, instead of using that sort of public investment to bring us where we need to be, with incentives for electric, for those same customers. On the building side, we've got programs, and NYSERDA has programs, and NYSERDA is in the middle of, or not in the middle there, they are probably shortly will release, certainly this year, their roadmap for electrification and net zero carbon buildings. And the utilities have energy efficiency programs, they have electrification programs, but none of those programs are where we need to be, and none of them are targeting the affordable housing sector as much as is needed. We have codes, we have the great announcement from Mayor de Blasio today, and lots of municipalities can be adopting stretch codes to make buildings more efficient and ultimately all electric. And one thing that we haven't talked about on this call, but I think is also a huge issue that requires more thinking and conversation and work together is the funding and the financing. I mean, we can use our utility bill dollars to do this instead of things that are counter to this. But there are other sources of funding, and there was a new proposal in the state of the state for the Raise the Green Roof program. And I know the Green Bank and the New York Green Bank and others are thinking about how we can do more and better to finance efficiency and ultimately electrification in this sector. And we have a great example and experience with the work of NYSEG, the New York City Energy Efficiency Finance Corporation at the city level, to figure out, to demonstrate how we can target affordable housing and get the upfront dollars that are needed to make these investments in a sector that's been woefully underinvested in for decades. So that's a world of work that we can also work on together. And, if people are interested, we could have more of a conversation about Local Law 97. That is a carbon-based building policy at the city level that really should be driving this, but is not crafted in the best way to do that. So that's a place where, it could be one of the most progressive and bold moves that we're doing in this country, or it could be, completely undermined in the way that it's implemented and not drive any of these things. So there's an opportunity there, but it's not fully realized. So the other piece that I wanted to talk about a little bit is, why isn't this all happening? And, we have this huge, ambitious, best in the nation, best in the world climate legislation in New York, and yet we've got all of these challenges before us. And I think one answer to that is, it is happening and it will happen. We have the CAC developing the roadmap. I mentioned the NYSERDA roadmaps. The Public Service Commission has the gas planning proceeding. You know, the local law implementation, 97 implementation teams are hard at work. So people are working on these things. But there are a lot of reasons I think that we're not doing as well as we could to address all of these things. I mean, one is, this is a hugely complicated set of issues. And, you know, if you make mistakes in this area and you get it wrong, like people's heat go off, like people are conservative in thinking about it and really want to get it right. There's a lot of things on the table right now for state and local government with COVID and the economy, and getting the attention of people to focus on these things and allow the policies to move forward is a challenge. We are talking about long-term planning, and 20 years seems like a lot of time, but you know, for people who've been working in these issues for many years, it takes a lot of time, and we need all of that lead time, and we have to start now, or we're not going to get there. But these kinds of issues don't always have the urgency of some other issues, and that's something that all of us need to be able to convey to the stakeholders and to the policymakers, that this is an urgent issue. We're digging a hole. We got to stop digging and start building the solutions that we need. There's been so much focus, and this is in many, many states, and I do think New York is at the cutting edge, and this whole conversation is very cutting edge, and other states are definitely watching this. But New York, like many other states, has been much, much more focused on the power sector and getting the renewables in place and lined up. We're not quite there, but we have a lot of things, that's an understatement, but there's a lot of stuff in the works. Like, we know that we're going to be able to do that, and the things that we need to do to achieve that. We don't want to wait until the grid is 100% zero carbon before we start looking at the other sectors, how we're going to electrify buildings and electrify the transportation sector, because we are not getting all of the benefits that we intend to get if we're using a less than perfectly clean grid to power those sectors. But we have to do these things in parallel. We cannot wait and do them consecutively. And that has been an issue in policy design, where there's a concern about driving electrification whole hog before we've finished the work on the power sector. And just, you know, that's where people have started, and they're not focusing on the buildings and gas sector as much as is needed. And another challenge is, you know, it's not just the environment departments, it's not just the Public Service Commission and the way we regulate utilities. We have to be engaging the housing authorities, the housing at every level of government, and also labor, health. There are huge health issues here. And, you know, like any large organizations, government is often siloed, and having these different agencies at all levels of government work together and figure out these things together and have shared interests and goals and all be working towards them is not the way that we always work. And that's a learning challenge for us. But I think I've already seen a lot of progress on that front. And I think we can do more and better. Similarly, jurisdictionally, you know, the city and the state and the feds, and at least now the feds are in the game and we're not just suing them to prevent them from doing bad things, you know, clarity about jurisdictionally who's doing what and how these things all fit together so that we're leveraging policy at every level. I think Local Law 97 is a good example of the promise of that, but also how we can go sideways if we don't get that right. And then the last thing is just like, you can think about all of the different sort of the politics of it and all of the different challenges from different stakeholders of the issues that everybody's been discussing on this call. You know, if I'm building new construction, or I'm a homeowner with home heating oil, and I'm expecting that I'm going to get gas on demand and with the cost socialized, and that's how I've been factoring. And now you're telling me I'm going to have to pay for that. And I'm going to be up in arms about that. And here's all the bad things that are going to flow if you throw a wrench in the works by changing a rule on me like that. You know, that is a problem. So how do we get out in front of that problem and make sure that we can deliver to every potentially disgruntled constituent, or, you know, a new constructing person or a homeowner, here's a better or at least equal solution for you of how you can have, an electric option that works for you, that is as good or better in terms of the service that you want. And I do think there's some education to do about the quality of modern electrification. That we're not talking about baseboard heating. We're not talking about crappy, ring stoves. We're talking about induction cooking, the Tesla of cooking, and very high quality heating, better than you have now. And it works in all climates and all high rises of buildings, and at a comparable cost, because we have programs, or we're doing mass procurement, or whatever it is that we're going to drive those costs down and give people a value proposition that's appealing to them. Then it's going to be much easier to say, okay, we don't need to have this existing rule that's socializing the cost of for people. And that's just an example, but it's the kind of thing where, it will be so much easier to move policy forward when we have more people thinking through all of these things, and we've sort of addressed the challenges that people are worried about in terms of rolling all of these things out yet, because it hasn't been done. There's not a great example, even though these technologies are widely used across the globe, of the kind of transition that we're talking about, and we really are at the front of that. So I'm going to stop there, and hopefully we can dig into these issues more in the Q&A.
Great, thank you so much, Dale. So if I can ask all of the panelists to turn their video and audio on. For the Q&A, everyone is again welcome to enter any questions that you might have into the Q&A window on the Zoom window. And if you find any questions that you find compelling, feel free to use the upvote selection, and we'll keep an eye on that as we select questions. So to start us off, we have a question on how can the availability of natural gas service to retail customers be constrained without pushing those customers to oil and propane or really expensive forms of electric heat? Is there this sort of other kind of factor to be thinking about? Anyone want to start us off on that issue?
Well, that could be done through regulations. There can be regulations saying that you can't switch to those alternative fossil fuel sources. Wouldn't be popular, but it's at least legally possible.
Yeah, I'll jump in on that. I mean, that's where we need programs and incentives. I mean, if we took the money that we're currently using to socialize the cost of building a gas line out to a home heating oil customer's house, and instead we gave them that same amount of money as an incentive to bridge the cost for electrification, so they're getting high quality electric heat and cooking instead at the same cost, and it's a wash to society, because instead of paying for something that makes no sense and is going to end up being a stranded asset, we're paying something that's building our way to the future and has all these other benefits, including health benefits for those customers. That's a win-win, but we don't have that set up right now. But those are the kinds of programs that utilities and NYSERDA are developing, and I think need to, just need to scale.
I'll chime in with one other point, which is not quite an answer to the question, but I want to make use of the question to highlight the challenge where the source of the problem that the question gets at is available, well, it's within the bailiwick of multiple different agencies. And the solution is going to come from efforts on the part of multiple different agencies. So often when I hear a question like this posed, it has to do with, should we add a carbon price to the electricity sector? Won't that drive up costs when what we're trying to do is make electricity more attractive? Well, if we're going to have the carbon price to clean up electricity in the way that Dale described, while not driving people away, you're talking about having multiple different pieces of government contribute dissimilar solutions at the same time in a coordinated manner with an eye to whatever the price is that a given customer faces. So my answer, to the extent that there is one in this response, is coordination is an indispensable feature of whatever kind of solutions we're going to see. You should not look to one agency for this. And we focus a lot on the PSC, the commission, in our paper, but inevitably you're going to have to get responses in a coordinated manner from more than one agency.
Yeah, I would just add to some of the previous responses, and particularly to Dale's, I think. that one of the effects of the 100-foot rule as it is currently practiced in New York is that not only are the costs of line extensions socialized, but they're also obscured. Figuring out how much is actually being in effect granted for free to each individual requesting customer because it's simply there and it has to be carried out without any analysis is extremely difficult and not transparent and not available. And if we lived in a different world where that same amount were available to be put toward clean solutions, we literally don't know whether it would still look appealing or not. So making the costs actually visible and available is a great first step, and finding ways to put it at better parity with other solutions is really, really important.
And I'll add to that, you know, the utilities throughout the state are currently rolling out the installation of smart meters at residential level for customers. And those smart meters will enable a lot more line of sight into how energy is used and the rates for the times during which energy is being used. And there's a anticipation that with that technology in place, it'll serve as the foundation of a more dynamic system where more people can use electricity provided that it's distributed over a longer period of time. We can have things like thermal storage for hot water heater. Rather than having the hot water heater run continuously, it charges up by heating the hot water during periods of high renewable availability, and it turns itself off during periods of high pricing and low availability. So that's just one example of a myriad of technologies which will be deployed to take advantage of the more robust electric grid, thus making it more likely to handle the increase in load and expectations on it.
Great. So we had another question asking about sort of a comparison between New York and California's ambitions and challenges, but even more broadly, we talked a bit throughout the session about how New York is kind of at the forefront of these questions. Do any of you feel like there are important lessons to be learned either from California, other states, other countries, what other kind of pioneering efforts in this area are out there that might be models?
Well, I think one thing California is doing well on it is the building codes, the new requirements for new construction to meet certain energy levels and to incorporate solar and other assets into their design. I also want to add to that the gas moratoriums and cessations for new gas hookups. I believe the city of Berkeley moved forward with such a ban recently, and the mayor just proposed such a ban, which will hopefully be approved and enacted. But I think one of the best ways to advance this is to really start the process of stopping the growth of the system by minimizing new connections. As Elizabeth said earlier, the bigger the system, the bigger the stranded assets, the higher the cost for everyone at the end of the day. So if we can stop the hemorrhaging, so to speak, we can really begin the process of moving towards a electric society, a low carbon society with fewer long-term negative impacts and costs.
So there were some questions about Local Law 97. So Dale, I know you mentioned this a bit, but there's a question about the current state budget proposal that might sort of undermine aspects of Local Law 97 by allowing building owners to purchase RECs from anywhere in the state and from existing generation. You have thoughts about sort of the conflicts there, and I mean, more broadly, any kind of insights on Local Law 97 that anyone wants to share? We can get into that a bit.
Well, I would just say the, Local Law 97 was designed as with a carbon metric, understandably, but if you think about that, the state has already committed to decarbonize the power sector. They're sort of on top of that one. City law should really be designed to drive building owners to invest in their own buildings and make them more energy efficient and electric. And so if Local Law 97 is driving building owners to invest in renewables, it's not like that is a bad thing, just generically. I mean, there are issues with Part R, the new thing that you're talking about. But it's not that that's bad, it's that that's not what we need. What we need them to do is figure out how to scale that investment, make all the buildings super energy efficient, and especially to cover affordable housing and address some of the issues that Rory was talking about. So, you know, and then how quickly can we get the implementation rules for Local Law 97 to give building owners that signal and make sure that any dollars they're putting on the table, we're using in the smartest way to drive this transformation in buildings.
Anyone else want to chime in on anything around Local Law 97 in this context?
So I would just add for a little context that I agree with what Dale was just saying, and I just got a note that my internet connection is unstable, so we'll see what happens with that. But with the caveat that Local Law 97 was passed, I think a couple of months or a month or two at least before the CLCPA. So at the time it was entered into, it was carbon driven before the state developed the carbon driven approach. But I think the other challenge from here is that the CLCPA, and I think you alluded to this, Dale, is it's what's city jurisdictional, right? The city can govern its buildings, but not really the utility sector. So what we have is this rule that addresses large buildings, but not small buildings coming from the city. And then this drive for utility transformation potentially coming from the state. And it's going to be really important that those two are ultimately coordinated with one another, the building perspective and the grid perspective, or in the distribution system perspective.
So there's a question about the difference in strategy between incentives and other avenues to drive decarbonization, and a question about, you know, are incentives best suited as a catalyst to scale up attention or adoption of underutilized technologies? And if the goal is broader scale transformation, you know, should more attention be given to code standards, you know, sunsetting subsidies? Does anyone want to sort of talk about the trade-offs there and sort of how those things might work in conjunction on an optimal strategy?
So I would say we need all of the above, in that as a building owner or an electric utility or anyone else makes a rational economic choice, the incentives can play a major role in what their decision is. But I think there's no substitute for codes and standards in many of these areas, that we're just not going to have prices that are comprehensive or high enough to drive everything that's needed.
Yeah, I agree with that. And also, I mean, we don't want to use we don't want to jack up prices to make people change their behavior. We want to give people all the choices, and no matter what they choose, they're going to get the best performance that we can from an energy perspective. So I think of classic market transformation as like demonstrate that these technologies work, use incentives to pull them into the market, and now they become commonplace, but they're not industry standard practice, but we know we can do it. And then codes and standards are sort of like lifting the floor, get all the crappy stuff out of the marketplace. So, and that's a cycle, you just keep doing it. So, you know, if you just go to a standard and you don't have the solutions in the marketplace, that is a recipe for the whole thing to blow up in your face and to have pushback. This has to be durable. We have to keep, you know, it has to be quick too. So, you know, there's a little tension there. So even signaling, we are definitely going to have a standard, but we're going to have it in 5 years. Maybe not 10 years, then, you know, that's also giving that signal to the marketplace. But you have to use these things in combination to make sure that you're doing it in the most cost-effective way, and you're not going to, and it's an orderly transition.
So I want to talk a bit more about some of the financing issues that we sort of touched on briefly. So do any of you have thoughts on the most realistic and promising sort of financing possibilities in the near term, and then, you know, looking, you know, farther out on the horizon, you know, are there sort of bolder possibilities that will allow for this kind of enormous transformation that everyone has, you know, discussed in depth today?
Well, one thing that is under discussion as I mentioned, is a price on a carbon adder on wholesale electricity markets. And that could generate a lot of money, and it would be huge questions about where does that money go. But some fraction of the money could go to pay for some of these low-income building retrofits, for example, and would sort of socialize the cost, would spread the cost out along a broader population. So that's just one possibility that's under discussion.
I would say I think that question is probably aimed at solutions, but I also just want to bring it back to the problem, which is that currently most financing models that are available assume a siloed approach to utility service. You're not allowed to dip into the gas kitty to do the electric thing. This is not going to work for very much longer. And so I don't have a single or specific answer to the question as far as what is the correct solution, but whatever it is, it's going to involve breaking that. And one of the things we highlight in our article is not quite the financing solution, but the analytical solution, where a benefit cost analysis should not just look within those silos, it should look across them. That kind of analysis, I think, is probably going to be the lead or the harbinger, hopefully, of a follow-on financing solution of a similar sort.
I just want to make the distinction between financing and cash money. I mean, financing is an excellent answer to a classic financing problem, which energy efficiency shows to us. I mean, you have upfront costs, but it pays for itself over time because we know we're going to have savings. And I'll give another shout out to NYSEG. They're great at doing this, especially in the affordable housing sector. There are some cases where we just need to invest in historically underinvested space, like affordable housing. I mean, there are just investments we need to make that are not necessarily going to pay for themselves over time in the same way, because you need to upgrade buildings that have deteriorated, that are not electrification ready. So, states and cities are strapped, right? But there's a big stimulus coming, we hope. So, that is a place where if you have money coming from the feds and you want to invest in more and better housing for people, then can you tie strings to it? Or can cities and states just be very smart in the way they deploy those resources so that you're doing multiple things at once, which goes to the, what you were just saying also, Justin, about like multiple different agencies have to be thinking about the same set of issues together. We want all of these things. We want more and better housing. And part of what better means is addressing all the stuff that we're talking about.
Yeah, and building just a little bit on that, to be completely clear, there's no trade-off between efficiency and getting off the gas and onto electrification, because the burden, how hard it's going to be to electrify, depends substantially on how efficient the building is in the first place. So to come in and electrify a building with just terrible energy characteristics is going to wind up being a much heavier lift than electrifying a building that's actually operating very efficiently and holding the resulting heat well. So just improving this antiquated, not well-maintained building stock that exists in a lot of communities sets them up a lot better to completely get off the fossil fuel. They absolutely go together.
Right, and I want to add to that.
Go ahead.
Sorry, thank you. I want to add to that, the electrification make ready that Dale mentioned earlier. I think that's going to be critically important. When you look at electrification projects in isolation of a traditional gas improvement for a building, you're often going to find it's uneconomical, because what you need to do, you also need to upgrade a variety of systems that were not designed to provide that level of electric use in the first place. And that upgrade may make those systems appear to be less effective in the long run, and may not line up with ownership cycles for some buildings. The payback period may not line up. So one of the things we need to seriously consider is moving forward with these kind of make-ready solutions, some of which may not actually have a near-term tangible energy savings, but others, such as recladding a building, adding insulation, things like that to make the building more thermally sealed, can. And these are many things that can be done while you're still operating on natural gas. as the beginning steps towards transitioning to an electrification future.
I want to chime in quickly just to say that a useful analogy to that sort of make ready step is the smart meters that Rory already mentioned. Smart meters are going to be useful for a long list of things, and most of that list we don't know yet. They're expensive. They're still a good idea to install because it's really clear that having access to more timely information is going to prove useful in ways that are hard to foresee right now. I think that kind of make ready step similarly will bear difficult to foresee financial fruit in the not too distant future.
And I was just going to say that this raises the financing issue, that the efficiency measures and the make-ready measures, you need to spend the money now, but the benefits aren't realized for a period of years. And so you need to get the money up front to enjoy the long-term benefits.
Okay. So we just have 3 or 4 minutes left. I'll try to get to hopefully 2 more. There's one question about NYCHA's role in moving toward electrification. I don't know if any of you have thoughts specifically about NYCHA and sort of what that process might look like, and what people might look out for.
Well, I fear I'm uniquely suited to answer this question. I just wrote a report on that. The NYCHA climate mitigation study essentially looked at what options are available to NYCHA for pursuing an electrification pathway. And through that study, we make it pretty clear we could make NYCHA's existing infrastructure as efficient as possible, but as long as we're using natural gas, the best NYCHA could achieve is an intermediate 2030 goal, but it could never achieve a 2050 goal unless it were to electrify. Now, the analysis we conducted showed you wouldn't even need to electrify the entirety of the portfolio. You need to convert hot water from fossil fuel to electric, but you'd only need to convert roughly 60% of the portfolio's heating system, and the remaining 40%, as long as it's well maintained, pausing there, could operate on natural gas, and the NYCHA could achieve 80 by 50 goals. But the main concern with NYCHA is, where is that money going to come from? NYCHA has experienced decades of funding shortfalls that cumulatively have put it in a state of significant disrepair. So as Dale was saying earlier, the potential for a stimulus could significantly alter the potential future for NYCHA and the city as a whole on their path towards achieving these goals.
Great, that's super useful. All right, so then as our last question to wrap things up, there was a question about whether any interesting efforts are already being undertaken by New York legislators or regulators to try and make some of these remedies that have been discussed today. Are there bills or rulemakings that are on the horizon, or that any of you see as kind of near to midterm possibilities? And as sort of the tangent there is, are there ways that the concerned public can get involved on this front?
So the CLCPA process has a series of meetings that are open to the public. In fact, participants, if you were to Google CLCPA public meetings, you'll find a link that'll take you to the list of meetings that'll be happening in the future. Each meeting touches on a number of different things. There's a power gen meeting, of which I'm a panel member. There's meetings on efficient housing, agriculture, and a wide array of other topics, and public participation is encouraged. And you can join in on any of these webinars as they're scheduled. So that's an option.
Great. Well, I think we're about out of time. I want to send a very sincere thanks to all of our amazing panelists today. This was a really useful discussion. As mentioned before, we will post the video from this session on our site, and we'll try to send an email out to participants about the availability of that once it's ready. I want to also quickly thank my colleague Chris Beltrone, who did a great deal of work in organizing the session today. Again, I encourage you all to check out Justin and Elizabeth's paper if you haven't already. And thank you again for attending, and hope this was interesting and useful for everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you for putting this together.
Thank you so much.